All right, everybody. We have a presentation by Dr. Nick Menchyk. Nick grew up in Western Pennsylvania and graduated from Clemson University with a BS in turf grass management and a PhD in plant and environmental science in 2007 and 2012, respectively. While a graduate of Clemson, Nick focused on improving foliar fertilization efficiency, soil nutrition, and plant physiology. Nick began teaching at Farmingdale State College in the fall of 2014, where he continues to educate students about horticultural best management practices. He currently lives in Pennsylvania with his wife, Laura, and their 2.5-year-old son, Harrison. Please welcome Dr. Menchyk.
I'm going to talk a little bit about managing soil for native plants, and hopefully in that management, you're mitigating the introduction of invasives. And obviously that's easier said than done, but I'll do my best to kind of jump around a little bit here and talk about a couple of different topics. So thank you for having me this morning. Yeah, there I am. I realize that's a color coordinated picture there of myself, our son Harry on my back there, and then my wife Laura in the back part of that picture. Yeah, I've been at Farmingdale for almost 10 years now, and my background is in plant and environmental science and a turf background from Clemson University. And so, yeah, I've been a kind of a generalist, jack of all trades of horticultural topics at Farmingdale, but turf management, soil science, plant nutrition, general horticulture, the list goes on and on and on of courses that I will teach in any given semester at Farmingdale State College. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these topics, looking at mapping and soil testing, targeting soil tests. We'll get a little bit into invasive control options just quickly due to time, and focus on best management practices, some general best management practices when we're trying to do our best to manage our soil, improve our soil health, while at the same time limiting the proliferation of these invasive weedy plants. And as I said before, that's easier said than done. They're weeds, they're invasive for a reason, and they really thrive in disturbed sites. And so we'll talk about some of the things that we can do there. And then I'll touch on a couple of different papers. Now, there's a bunch of papers out there that talk about the effects of chemical controls and pesticides with our soil and with our natural environment, and talk about some of the pros and cons there, and some of the realities of using those tools. As we heard, they can be really effective, and they are really useful tools in the toolbox, but we should recognize their limitations and recognize some of their benefits, certainly. So why should you care about the soil? And I think when I'm talking to a group like this, it's kind of a silly question. I think most of you, I'll go back there, sorry. Most of you, if not all of you, know that the soil is our ally, and we need to treat it with respect and with care. The soil provides a lot of benefits, many of them that we don't think about when you're taking a walk through the woods, or gardening in your own backyard, or in your vegetable garden. Um, it it provides a lot of benefit to us, and if we don't have soil, we really don't have life on Earth like we know it. And there are a lot of aspects of soil that we can't control. We can't control in various ways. We can't really control the slope. I mean, depends on how much money you have. I suppose you can start moving soil around quite a bit. But in general, when we're talking about these areas that we're trying to conserve, we're trying to improve, we're not going in there with a heavy-handed sort of strategy. We can't control slope. We can't control texture. We can't control the day-to-day climate. Certainly, we have influence on climate change and such. Um, there are a lot of things that we can't control. You have to play the hand that you're dealt with the soil and the environment that you're working within. But we can control how we cultivate that soil. We can control soil amendments to a certain degree, and we can control our management choices and decisions. And when you're making these choices, you should be thinking about the goal of improving soil health and soil quality and improving the performance of that soil, or at least conserving the performance of that soil uh, to deliver on the goals of improving the environment for native plants. Um, and certainly those goals are going to vary depending on what you're trying to do, and your management is going to vary depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Soil health and soil quality, these are terms that over the last probably 30 years have been used more and more in articles and peer-reviewed journal papers and such. Uh, these are terms that are similar but slightly different, and they're measuring the ability, you can see there, of a soil to carry out some particular ecological function, whether it's a chemical function, biological, physical function. There's a lot going on in that soil. And as I said, there's a lot that we take for granted that our soil microorganism uh, community, our microbiome, is providing to us in terms of nutrient turnover and cycling and decomposition. And the list goes on and on and on. And I always tell the students that it's really your goal as a manager of plants to grow healthy, happy roots. If you can grow healthy, happy roots, then you're going to have generally a healthy, happy plant. What's going on below ground is many times much more important than what might be going on above ground. It's just that we notice what's going on above ground, and then we commonly too often forget about all of the life and processes that are going on below ground. And so if we have healthy soils, we're going to have a better success rate in growing our plants. And you can see reduced expensive human interventions and inputs from to manage these unhealthy degraded soils. Now, Long Island is, I don't know, maybe the epicenter of soils that have been changed through various reasons, whether it was agricultural fields that have been established, or if it's just, another Walmart or another shopping center or another apartment complex or whatever it may be. I mean, we have soils on Long Island that are pretty good soils that we can be very successful with in terms of growing plants. We can see evidence of that obviously out in the east end of Long Island being still an agricultural and horticultural powerhouse. But there's a lot of areas of Long Island that have been disturbed over the course of time of people living on Long Island, from cutting down trees for materials to supply building materials for the city. The beginnings of the civilization hundreds of years ago, to just the urban sprawl that's happened in the last, I don't know, 60 to 70 plus years on Long Island. We've changed our soils, we've disturbed our soils, and we have a very different reality with our soils now compared to what we had prior to all of that change and all that disturbed nature that we've created. And so we've been given, in a lot of cases, degraded soils that are compacted, have changes in chemical makeup, changes in structure, abrupt sort of boundaries between different contrasting materials and textures and compaction. And a lot of the time in those environments, our invasive plants thrive, our weedy plants thrive. I always mention to our students, it's going to be your job at some point in time to say, you're going to be given the task. Hey, okay, let's grow plants, design and grow plants on this disturbed landscape, and you're left with subsoil that's compacted and coarsely textured, and uh, is not really a great environment. And so we want to always think about that, put it in the context of, okay, we're not really starting from a clean slate. We're not necessarily starting in an untouched landscape. We're always dealing with some sort of disturbed environment that's going to make it uh, certainly more challenging from a management perspective. And we're always going to want to try to manage it in a way that kind of mimics or tries to get as close as we can to that natural environment. And so we need to evaluate that soil. We should get an idea of what's going on in that soil. And you can see here, soils and water. I mean, what we do on land, obviously all the people here, I think, are well aware of the fact that what we do on the land has effects on what's going into our water. And what we do on the land, any input that we utilize to manage plants, to manage our landscapes, to manage our areas where we're trying to conserve, they have effects. Any sort of input, whether it's a fertilizer, whether it's a pesticide, and that pesticide could be organic or inorganic, synthetic, whatever. We all have an impact on the environment. Even when we're trying to do the best thing possible, there's probably an impact that might not be necessarily desirable. But we have to evaluate what's going on. And you can see there, determine the suitability of plants to the site prior to planting, determine the need for remedial work prior to planting, and that's going to be a huge one here. There's a lot of things that we can do potentially prior to planting that are going to be a lot more difficult after the fact. We can evaluate the soil and water to sort of evaluate, you can see the influence of those management practices or influence on those management practices. And then we can certainly figure out, okay, well, what are some of the problems that exist there? What are some of the environmental conditions of that site that might be driving the preponderance of a particular species or a group of species that are going to be challenging? And one of the best ways that we can do this evaluation is through soil sampling. And I'm a big proponent of targeted soil sampling and using the Web Soil Survey, which we'll talk about here over the next few slides, as a way to provide a guideline. I always like to use the sort of idea that you're fitting in the outer sort of straight pieces of your jigsaw puzzle. Once and I become well acquainted with this with a 2.5-year-old with a big like dinosaur jigsaw puzzle. We got to find those straight pieces. Once we figure out that outline, we know what we're looking at. Then we start fitting in the other pieces. And soil sampling is very much like that, trying to get an idea of what the picture looks like. And then from there, you start to make decisions based on your results and your interpretation of the soil test. And I'll talk a little bit more about interpretation later. That is a major part of this, and unfortunately, I'm going to kind of skip over it a little bit. But we got to take a representative sample, and that typically means subsampling, mixing to get a good look, a representative sample of that site. That might mean we have multiple representative samples of that site depending on the size, and we can send that sample off to look at some of the things that we'll see a little bit later to get an idea of what's going on chemically and physically with that soil. So targeted soil sampling is something that can be done relatively easily for free. And I always champion this tool, the Web Soil Survey. This is a free tool. If you go to that URL, this is an NRCS and USDA collaboration that has replaced those those big books that we used to use, we still use them, they're still out there, still show the students that those web soil or those soil survey books in the soils class every semester when we teach soils, black and white aerial photos, page upon page of information for the given soil types that are there and the limitations and so on and so forth. All of that information has been put online. And if you type in web soil survey into your search bar, you will see this website. You click on that big green button. It says Start WSS. And then you go in and you can find your property. You can put in your address. You can put in the closest address to your area, define your area of interest, and then you can start to explore the soil information for that site. So what this looks like when you start the web soil survey is it looks like this. You see a map of the lower 48 on this sort of bar on the left side. You have all these quick navigation tools, address, state, county, soil survey. You know, you can put in there Latin longitude coordinates, depending on what you want to do. I will say this right now. I know how to use this, but I have not explored every single functionality of it. There's a lot of information that's in this database, and it's incredibly interesting to me and useful, I think, in many ways, for soil testing and for just exploration of your site and what's going on at your site, in an effort to help manage your soil or at least gather information about your site for management purposes. So if we put in an address over there, I'll just give you an example. I use this. I use the address, Sunken Meadow State Park. This was some research that we did. I did in collaboration with Cornell at this point, several pre-pandemic. So might as well be 500 years ago. But we did this with Cornell in the turf team at Cornell, where we were going to map the soils of Sunken Meadow State Park to help them sort of pinpoint their nutrient management program, really cutting down on the total amount of nutrients and fertilizers going out onto a golf course. So I put in Sunken Meadow State Park here. You can see that generates a little cursor right there on the massive parking lot. And then we want to define our area of interest, and we have those two little buttons up top. One is a square, polygon, a rectangle, area of interest tool, and then you start to define your area of interest. And what that looks like is this. You click and drag, you find your area of interest, you double click, and then the web soil survey generates that map, zooms in a little bit, and then starts to give you a lot of information about the different soil types that are there. And you can see on the left side of the screen over here, we have the names of the soil series. So that's like the most specific information that we can get about a soil. So just a quick sort of recap on soil taxonomy. It's very much just like the taxonomy of plants and animals: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We can do essentially the same thing for soils. We get all the way down to series, and those are named. And so you can see on that left side where it says map unit name, Carver and Plymouth sands, 3 to 15% slopes, so on and so forth. There's an abbreviation there, acres that are occupied in that area of interest, and the percentage of that area of interest that's occupied by that given soil series. And you can go in there and you can start to click on each one of these links, and it will give you a lot of information about the climate, frost-free days, the soil profile. The information is endless. For instance, if we look at this, we'll go to Planting Fields Arboretum. You can go in there, map that, and you can go through and look at the functionalities for water movement, water management in that given site. And in this case, we have hydrologic soil groups, and this is looking at runoff potential. And there are classes there, A through D. And in that map, we have most of it shaded in that sort of turquoise color, which is Group C. And these are all Montauk loams, which have this Class C, where you can see there it says having low infiltration rate when thoroughly wet. So we know Long Island, for the most part, we have coarse textured soils. They drain relatively quickly. We have in a lot of cases, very shallow water tables. Not always the case. And certainly when we have soils that are thoroughly wet, we have a chance of water running off in these permeable soils that are typically going to allow for water to move through. In certain situations, under saturation, water and materials move and run off the surface. And as we know, there's a lot of development along Island. We have a lot of impermeable surfaces, and so there's a lot of reasons why we have water quality issues with the Great South Bay or portions of Long Island Sound, Peconic Bay. Although those things are improving, as we know. If we look at using the Web Soil Survey for soil mapping and soil harvesting and testing, I think this is a really good tool because you can determine significantly different soil types. And in this case, we have a little, county park here, East Islip Marina Park. And I just mapped the lower sort of tip of that area. And there are, and I identified it there with that blue and red star, there are two completely different types of soil there. We have one that's fill land, dredged material. So to make that sports field, I mean, the materials dredged out of the Great South Bay and some of those areas, those tidal areas, and put in to create artificial land there, or real land made from dredged material. That's very different from that Walpole sandy loam that is identified by that red arrow over there. So we have different soils. My point is, with this web soil survey, is that we can go in there, map your site, identify the soils, and then we can go, all right, well, it makes sense to if we're going to manage this part over here and look at the soil chemical and physical nature of it, well, let's sample and get a representative sample over there, and then we would get a different representative sample over here. It wouldn't make sense to mix those things. You'd get a kind of a meaningless average that really isn't applicable to either of those areas. So we want to be as targeted as we can, and we can do that relatively easily. We can at least identify these different soils relatively easily, and figure out, all right, these are different, and we should look at it in a targeted way, and those sampling efforts should follow that. Now, I will say that this web soil survey, I think, really shines and is more useful when you have a bigger area, because in that bigger area, as you might expect, there's more variability. When you get into smaller parcels of land, the likelihood that there are widely different soil types is probably a lot less common. That likelihood goes down quite a bit. So, you're looking at an area that's mapped there. It's almost 30 acres. We have two different types of soil. If you bring that down into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 acres, the likelihood might be a little bit less. But even in those situations, you can figure out what's going on in that soil. You can at least get a baseline understanding of the type of soil that's there. And then when you do your soil sampling, you can figure out what you might have to do or what your challenges are in that soil from a chemical, physical standpoint, from a management perspective. And one of the big things that we will look at would be your fertility inputs, or the fertility sort of cycling, nutrient cycling in your soil. And you can't make any sort of decision with your soil, I argue, until you get some basic information about it. I always tell the story to my students that I was consulting on a North Shore estate with an alum of our program, and she was working at this estate, and talked to to the turf manager there, and it was well within my wheelhouse. I started asking the gentleman, about what the fertility program was, soil management fertility program was. And he was saying, oh, I always put out lime, I always do this. And I said, well, what was your pH of your soil? And he never answered the question. Kept asking him, poking at him, hey, what was your pH? And then he came back, he's like, oh, my pH was like 2, and it was like obvious to me, 2. He said 2. I said, okay. I didn't think that was probably likely or possible. And it just seemed obvious that he started doing things without taking a soil sample, without knowing anything about that soil, uh, assuming a lot of things, and likely just applying fertilizers and soil amendments and things um, to make money and not necessarily to move the ball forward or improve that soil health or improve the physical or chemical components of that soil. And so, that's just something that I don't think I don't think that's right. Obviously, that's not how we're going to do this as educated professionals. We need to have an understanding of what's going on there. And we can do this pretty quickly. I mean, we can go and get a soil test, send it off or to a local lab, Cornell Cooperative Lab. I mean, there's a lot of places where you can send off a soil sample and figure out what your pH is, figure out what your nutrient concentrations are, understand what your cation exchange capacity is, um, see what your organic matter values are. Texture is something that you can figure out on your own. Uh, there's a really quick and easy way to determine soil texture by feel, but you can send that off and get an objective analysis of soil texture and the physical properties of the soil, which is incredibly important because it influences so many other variables within our soil and our soil performance. Um, and so it's important to look at these things and get an idea of what your pH is and what all of these chemical starting points are. And I will say that it's not my goal to sit here and talk to you about soil testing and soil test and do soil tests. I'm not trying to get you to soil test to then apply more materials to your soil. Because unfortunately, that's all too common. People will soil test and then they'll start chasing their tail. Oh, I got to change this. I got to change this. I got to change this. I have to change this. Well, soil test, get a baseline understanding of what your chemical and physical nature of your soil is, and then maybe do a soil test in a year or so. Look at your trends and see how your management might have affected those parameters. It's just like if you were to have blood work done, you would look at that blood work and it might inform your doctor to say, all right, well, we need to do this with your diet. We need to do this with your medication or whatever it might be. And then you test again and you get a blood lab and you look, oh, okay, this worked, this didn't work. You're not going to go to a doctor. They're not just going to start throwing medications at you before they take some diagnostic tests. And so the soil test is, I think, one of your diagnostic tests that is commonly sort of overlooked and unfortunately sort of forgotten about. Now, like I said, soil test interpretation is a bit of a challenge because you can chase your tail. And you can look at these things and be convinced based on what you're researching and looking at online with different papers. Oh my goodness, my calcium levels are too low, or my magnesium level, or potassium. Look at your plants. Does the ecosystem, does it look like they're deficient? Does it look like they're struggling? Then maybe it could be something that would be chemically related to the soil. But to soil test and then continually apply inputs from a chemical standpoint or amendment standpoint, I think is a big mistake until you get an understanding of, well, how are the plants performing? Maybe those nutrients being low or considered deficient or considered sufficient or maybe even at higher or elevated levels, it might not be a big deal. but and then again, it could be a big deal, and that is something that you need to manage and think about. Once again, I'm looking at like kind of a 10,000 or 50,000 foot view today. I just don't want you to sort of, think, oh, soil test, and then that turns into inputs. Or some sort of desire to manage it in a way. Sometimes we're a lot of the time, at least in ornamental horticulture and turf management and things in public parks, a lot of times the managers are their own worst enemy because they want to do something. Sometimes not doing something might be the best thing to do. Once again, I'm sitting here on my chair, talking about the textbook examples here. I know the real versus ideal sometimes doesn't always line up, but we want to look at that soil from a physical and chemical standpoint before we start doing any sort of management to it, and recognizing here that your ability to modify that soil before you plant is going to be generally easier than after you've planted. Now, with Lisma and Linpea, we're looking at areas that are already sort of established areas, and it's not like you're starting over again. And so some applicability of this table is maybe reduced, but it's important to recognize that there's a lot of things that are associated with the soil that we can't change. Like I said before, we can't really just change texture. We can't really change the slope. We can't change these aspects or attributes of the soil that have taken thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, in some cases, millions of years to develop. Unfortunately, we're really good at destroying soil in a blink of an eye in comparison to how long it took to deform that soil. But when we're looking at it from a perspective of management, it's much easier to do these things prior to planting than after planting. But yeah, I mean, you can see there, I mean, the highest sort of qualitative ranking there is good. There's no like excellent ability to do anything with our soil in many cases because of the sort of glacial pace of the change in soil physical and or potential and even chemical changes. It typically takes a very long time to do that. All right, keep moving on here. There's a lot of research out there. I cherry picked a couple of different articles here with some of Long Island and New York State's, kind of well-known invasives. Looking at garlic mustard here, there's this reality that all plants, beneficial, natives, or exotic invasives, they all change the soil in one way or another. This article from 2008, now it's kind of old, of course, but they found that these soils that were invaded by garlic mustard were consistently and significantly higher in nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and had higher soil pH. There's a lot that you can read into that in terms of how land is managed, if these areas just naturally have higher levels of those nutrients, or if areas were managed and over fertilized. They can find these trends where certain species will thrive and dominate and kind of take over. I am a little skeptical to think that, all right, well, the nutrient cycling, you can see their release of volatile compounds did not significantly alter soil nitrogen availability, so on and so forth. And at the bottom there, it says the garlic mustard significantly increased the rate of decomposition of native trees or native tree species, indicating fundamental changes in nutrient cycling are more important than those inhibitory effects of the secondary metabolites that are found within those microbes and that leaf litter that might be generated by garlic mustard. I'm always kind of not skeptical. No, skeptical is a good word to use for it. I'm a little bit hesitant to kind of say, oh, it's the chemical nature of that soil, and it's gonna influence and cause that particular invasive species to dominate. These invasive species find a way, and it's going to be likely more the case that these species will dominate because they are quick to grow. They smother out the native flora that are there. They can reproduce very quickly. They can grow and have high levels of plasticity in terms of the environmental conditions that they can grow successfully in. And yeah, they're going to change the landscape. They're going to change that soil to some degree. But I think it's going to be tricky to kind of like just look at the soil nutrients, try to maybe manage them in a way that then will keep garlic mustard out. I think that's a fool's errand. But it's all interrelated. So I'm not sure what I'm telling you right now. There's a big body of research on this. So cherry picking a couple papers is a big task. We'll jump into control options here. You know, we've heard about the joys of physically removing weeds already this morning. You know, it's hard work. You know that it is really, really, in some cases, effective, but in small areas. When we look at it from a soil perspective, you're usually not just removing the plant, you're removing the plant in some level or some amount of soil along with it. And when you're physically, mechanically removing plant material, you're disturbing that site even more. And we should always try to think about ways that we can reduce the level of soil disturbance when we're trying to make these management decisions. Um, yeah, I mean, there are sites on the North Shore I was looking at with students over the past couple of semesters, the past couple of years. It just the understory is dominated with multiflora rose. I mean, it's the who's who of invasive escaped ornamentals, you know, Wanamus and things, and multiflora rose and garlic mustard underneath it. And, you know, you're going, how can we come in here and manage this and not be an agent of disturbance? It's difficult. And there's another picture there of just multiflora rose just choking out the undergrowth. English ivy going up the trees. Ampelopsis. I mean, everything that you would imagine that would be there is there. And we got to think about ways that we can remove and manage that plant material without disturbing that soil. And so you want to, in many cases, limit the access points into a given area, choose equipment or a method that doesn't compact that site even more and change that soil from a chemical or physical perspective. And that's one of the things that I think is important is a lot of the times for plant health and plant success, the physical properties can outweigh the chemical nature of that soil. If you have compacted soils, if you have soils that don't drain, if you have soils that are really maybe fine textured or on the flip side are really coarse textured, they don't hold on to water. A lot of the time, those physical properties are more influential than those chemical properties. It just so happens that it's more difficult in many cases to change those physical properties, and so the focus becomes on the chemical side of the management. And so, you know, that's where you get into that sort of, you know, kind of catch-22 of sampling soil and then applying some sort of chemical input to it. And you know, that can be a slippery slope, certainly. So we want to minimize our soil disturbance and yeah, just recognize and adjust our expectations of what we can do and what's possible and what our limitations are. Best management practices for chemical control. And these are going to be dictated to you in most cases. You can't just go out there and do whatever you want in terms of managing that soil and your landscape, reducing erosion, and trying to use, if it's possible, mulches or some other sort of temporary cover to reduce that open soil, to reduce that erosion and loss of a precious resource into our lake streams, and ultimately into the ocean, because we know that that only is not, losing a precious resource, but it's also polluting that water. So using silt fences and those types of things to manage that runoff when we're doing this mechanical control is incredibly important. And like I said, most of the time it's going to be dictated, that you have to do these things for various reasons. Switching gears here, I got about 10 slides left, so we should have enough time here. I'll keep moving. Chemical control options. They're effective tools. They're only as good as the person applying them. They're only as good as the person that is identifying the weed or the invasive, using the equipment that's properly calibrated. You can see all those things that are down there. Having an understanding of the environmental implications of applying any sort of treatment. And that's something that we should think about. And I already mentioned it today. Anytime you're applying a treatment, it's an herbicide, it's a fertilizer, it's a soil amendment, you're turning on the irrigation system where you're applying water. All of those different inputs have an impact, have a potential impact and a potential damaging impact. And so we shouldn't take that lightly, and we should think about what the potential, downfalls of a particular input might be. And we shouldn't just consider, your chemical control options or chemical inputs as the potentially damaging inputs. Over irrigating could be damaging in a slightly different way. So you got to, obviously, we got to follow that label. The label is the law. I think, we all know these things, but a lot of times, whether it's the wording on that label, I'm sure, Andy, who's in attendance here, has talked to many groups about these things, herbicide labeling, pesticide labeling. I mean, they're not always straightforward and clear, and there's always elements of these pesticide labels that are up for interpretation that might be challenging and problematic. We got to be responsible, and we have to keep in mind that the herbicide or the pesticide is not the only option, and it shouldn't be the first thing on our decision tree of, okay, we have a problem, what can we spray? It should be, all right, what are the other things that we can do? What other management decisions can we make before we get to the point of selecting a potential herbicide tool to make an application to potentially mitigate the prevalence of an undesirable plant or an invasive plant. This is a quick list from one of my favorite Purdue extension documents, looking at herbicide use and weed management. There's probably a lot of these questions that are thrown around each and every growing season after an herbicide application. And these are questions that should be asked if you made an application and that application wasn't effective. You should be going through these questions to yourself. Well, okay, well, what did I know what I was spraying for? Does that herbicide have that species on it? If it doesn't, you're spraying off label. It's illegal. Did you use an appropriate rate? Did you get good coverage? Were you using appropriately calibrated equipment? A lot of times these herbicides will suggest using a surfactant, a non-ionic surfactant, improve the wetting of that leaf tissue and the uptake of that herbicide into that leaf. What was the temperature? What was the soil moisture like? This is an interesting one. I mean, in certain cases, there are weeds that you can spray them with a post-emergent herbicide, but if there's no soil moisture there and they're not taking up moisture and they're not actively growing, that herbicide can kind of sit there and be a lot less effective than it would if it was actually being taken up and metabolized by that plant. Were you applying it with something else? Was there an antagonistic reaction in that spray tank? Did it rain after application? I mean, there's a million different problems that can arise when you make an application that would result in your weed not being killed or your population of invasive plants being controlled or at least suppressed. And that's another thing too. I mean, usually we're talking about herbicide applications for these weeds. It's not a one and done thing, as we know. It's a continual effort usually, and so that is something that needs to be recognized. The timeline of application and control can be protracted, especially with these really tough perennial plants that have vegetative structures that pretty much just don't care what you spray on them, unfortunately. Glyphosates, and you saw triclopyr and glyphosate. There are other herbicides out there certainly that are used, but there's a lot of concern on, okay, well, we're using a lot of glyphosate and we have concerns about soil health and environmental health. And the body of research that's out there is quite large, and there are some conflicting results there. Um, Overall, it's been found, and generally you can see there, considered to have minimal environmental impacts. Um, Now, I'm not unaware of all the issues that surround blanket applications of Roundup and weeds that become resistant and non-target effects and drift. And I mean, there's a million problems with glyphosate. And I'm not some person that's just championing the unadulterated use of glyphosate. Um, but there are some realities that exist in the scientific, the body of research that show, okay, if used responsibly, um, that glyphosate can be a useful tool. Those herbicides can be a useful tool in your toolbox. Shouldn't be the only tool in the toolbox, but it should be one that should be considered. This was a paper. Now, once again, this is like from what, 22 years ago, but this is one that I found looking at this ponderosa pine plantation, where the researchers were looking at glyphosate and dosing glyphosate to bacteria and fungi that were found in that area, but they did it in soil-free media in a controlled environment in a lab, and they found that it was toxic to that bacteria and fungi. But when they added it to the soil, there wasn't any toxicity to those species. And it said there that the microbial respiration was unchanged regardless of soil type and with and without glyphosate there. And I found this one to be interesting. Once again, this is a paper. You can find that paper. Pretty sure it's open source. They actually had increased microbial activity because those soil microbes actually use glyphosate as a food source. I mean, these microbes, and that's reality of all these pesticides. You apply them, they do their job. Hopefully, they do their job, and then they don't stick around in the environment. But when they do, they typically get broken down by microbes in that soil. And those microbes, in many cases, don't care where that carbon comes from, where that nitrogen or whatever that metabolite they need comes from. In this case, they found that the microbes actually had a kind of a boom in activity after that glyphosate application. And yeah, long-term repeated applications had minimal effect on seasonal microbial characteristics, so on and so forth. Once again, that's one paper. Here's another paper. This is newer. It's two papers in about 10 years ago. And they looked at mycorrhizal fungi. In this case, are buscular mycorrhizal fungi. And we know that mycorrhizal fungi, a lot of you probably know, it's beneficial. It's kind of the rule, not the exception. Most plants have some sort of mycorrhizal relationship. This improves uptake of nutrients and minerals, and improves the plant health. And they found that this research found that glyphosate can reduce the spore viability and root colonization, and could potentially affect plant diversity and plant growth and plant health. So there's I'm somewhere in the middle there, where you go, pro glyphosate or anti-pesticide. I think there are areas where they're a useful tool. And with that said, we need to understand that there are potential impacts. I would like to believe, and it's been a while since I read that paper, but I'm pretty certain that those microbes in the soil bounce back relatively quickly to pre-application rates, would be my guess. But that continued pressure might, over the long term, select for different types of species, and might have an effect on long-term soil health and soil productivity for native plants, and for the management of your desirable plants in a given landscape. So chemical control best management practices. We want to know what we're trying to control, so we can have the most targeted approach. We want to encourage that soil health, and get an idea of the physical and chemical starting points of that soil before we can maybe try to apply some sort of amendment or fertilizer or whatever it may be. We want to reduce disturbance in our soils. I mean, probably the well-known example of that with agriculture would be conservation or no-till. No-till systems a lot of times rely on more herbicides than the previous sort of conventional systems. That's just a reality of it. We're not trying to disturb the soil. We're trying to reduce that disturbance. There's a big body of research that shows that that's going to be really, really beneficial for us long term. And then, you can see lastly there, herbicides are not the cure, only one tool in your toolbox, which we've heard that already stated a couple times in my talk here, but in the beginning speakers during this session. Yeah, know that those basic properties. If you haven't sampled your soil, I think it's in your best interest to go use that web soil survey. Test your soil, get an idea of chemical, physical standpoints, or beginning sort of, like I said, like the puzzle piece, jigsaw piece. Get an idea of what you can do before and after you're making these management decisions. And then reach out. Obviously, everybody here knows that there are really good people out there with knowledge of native plants and where they thrive, and start to go in there and look at what your plant palette can be given your soil conditions, given your environmental sort of conditions and microclimates. And it should always be in your best interest to promote root growth, hold on to water, hold on and cycle those nutrients, sort of champion gas exchange in and out of that soil through, if you can, through appropriate cultivation or management practices, and hold on to carbon in many cases. Certainly that carbon cycle, we're going to have a release, and we're going to have inputs into the soil, but that's going to be another thing that should be in your mind when you're looking at soil management. And you can do a lot of those things by not touching your soil too much. And that's the last thing I'll say. When you're going in and you're disturbing your soil, it's it's very likely that you're going to have a lot of unintended consequences with other invasives. And there's a big body of research that shows you can control invasives, or you can manage invasives, but it's never, oh, we did that once and now it's done. I think everybody here knows that. It's an ongoing management system. And so you don't want to do something that you're going to have to manage, do some sort of management practice that you're then going to have to manage by shooting yourself in your foot. there are those references. I believe I shared the slides. So if you want to get those references, some of those once again are newer than others. Some are kind of older, but all within 2000. So I got that going for me. Thank you so much. I do have class at 12. So I don't know how much, if anybody has any questions or not, but I appreciate you having me this morning. And I hope some of you got something out of that. I'm going to stop sharing.
I got a question.
Oh, Andy, go ahead.
What's up, Andy? Don't give me a hard herbicide question, please.
Nick, I just wondered if you could estimate a typical ground application of a post-emergent herbicide like glyphosate. What percentage of that spray is actually getting on the soil versus on the plants that are targeted?
That's a great answer. That it sounds like you might have the answer to. I don't know.
I don't either, but I would guess, when some of these soil experiments are conducted, they're assuming, a large amount is hitting the soil, but I think a lot less is hitting the soil when you're actually targeting plants rather than soil.
Yeah, I mean, I know that from foliar application studies that I've either conducted myself or done or researched, um, it's amazing how little nutrient or how little herbicide or we'll just say nutrients because that's what I know the best get into the plant, and so a lot of it's maybe being released volatilized off that plant or off that soil. But yeah, I would imagine that depending on your spray volume, it could be quite a bit of material that's getting into the soil.
Okay.
If you're using lower volume, smaller, droplets, in more of like a foliar application instead of a liquid application, it's probably likely you can mitigate that movement into the soil. One thing with glyphosate, and I'm sure Andy you're well aware of, is once it gets into the soil, it doesn't move, unless you move the soil, but it doesn't really leach through the soil like some of our other really highly damaging pesticides can.
Except the only exception to that would be in highly organic soil media, like in container mixes and that kind of thing.
Any other anytime Andy mentions herbicides and he asks me a question, I always get concerned because
What can I recommend that if folks have questions, because Dr. Menchyk needs to get to class, can you email them to us and we'll forward them to you? Would that work?
that's fine, yeah.
So invasive@lisma.org. Thank you very much, Dr. Menchyk. That was
Absolutely
very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your Friday and enjoy the weekend.